Hello and welcome to UnHerd News. I'm Freddie Sayers. Here we like to cover the important things that happen and occasionally the important things that don't happen. Because China has reopened after over 3 years of being stringently locked down, and there's a little bit of silence as to what's actually happened there. So we thought we would dig into it with our friend of the show and China watcher, Louis-Vincent Gave, who joins us from Hong Kong. Hi, Louis.
Hi, good to see you, Freddie.
Good to see you too. So I want to just start by going through a couple of media reports and compare them to what we know about reality in terms of what's been going on in China for the past few weeks. The Western media has been really excited about various projections and models that show eye-watering numbers of tragic deaths, of hospitals being overflowed, and I just want to see how much of that actually came true when China finally put an end to its 3-year-long lockdown. There was one model by a company called Airfinity, which is a huge independent health intelligence provider, which of course got picked up across the Western media. They said that daily infections would be at 2.2 million, daily deaths would be at 25,000, and then they said cumulatively since the 1st of December, they were expecting 188 million cases and 1.38 million deaths. Let's see how the Western media covered it. Well, The Guardian says China hospitals extremely busy amid surging wave of COVID infections. The Economist said inside China's COVID-ravaged hospitals, Chinese doctors are battling panic, overcrowding and their own fevers. Also Wall Street Journal, China's precarious moment, COVID everywhere. The Telegraph, this is the UK Telegraph, in these 2 streets alone, 20 people died from COVID last month. Time magazine came in as COVID-19 barrels through China. Some are turning to black market amid drug shortages. Reuters, new COVID model predicts over 1 million deaths in China. CNN, China could see nearly 1 million deaths as it exits zero COVID, study says. And onwards and onwards and onwards. So there is a real tilt towards numbers that were higher than even the World Health Organization now predicts. A couple of other things before I get into it with you, Louis, which is I've noticed some media outlets being increasingly creative, given the absence of high quality information about what is actually happening in China, about how they can measure what they are sort of wanting to be, I guess, a very grave disaster as the lockdowns finally end. The New York Times, for example, did a really unusual study, which they made a big splash out of, counting the scholars who were dying. So they counted obituaries, I'm not sure if you saw this, for academics from the state-backed Chinese Academy of Engineering and Chinese Academy of Sciences, and were counting individuals who had passed away as if this was a scientific way of measuring the number of people who died at the end of the lockdowns. And then when you look at the detail, a lot of these academics are literally in their 90s. October, they said four academics died, and they were aged 92, 90, 99, and 90. November, there were 5 deaths, aged 80, 102, 96, 89, and 100. But it seems for a newspaper that prides itself on scientific method and accurate reporting, it seems a strange way to estimate the number of deaths.
Does the New York Times still pride themselves on that?
Well, they say they do, Louis.
Okay.
I'm going to throw one more example at you before I'm going to let you speak, and that is the Washington Post.
Another paper that prides itself on accuracy and scientific rigor.
Well, increasingly, I think you're right to be skeptical about that. Their method for estimating the death tolls in China was satellite images showing crowds at China's crematoriums. Now, this is something we actually saw a lot during the pandemic. I'm not sure if that looks like a crowd or not, but they then rang up the receptionists at a few crematoriums who said they'd been busy, and this becomes a front page news story. So I guess my point is, laboriously perhaps expressed, that it felt like the Western media really wanted it to be a bit of a disaster for China when they finally decided against continuing their lockdowns. They were finding any scraps of evidence to prove that. And you're paying close attention not only to the health numbers because they affect the markets, and your business GavCal, you're sitting there in Hong Kong now, is all about China watching. What's your assessment of what actually happened in the real world?
Look, I would say my biggest surprise out of everything you've highlighted is that all these media outlets, whether the New York Times, the Washington Post, how come none of them commissioned Imperial College to run a model on what the deaths were going to be? They could have had much bigger numbers had they just asked the right people. If they'd gone and asked Dr. Neil Ferguson at Imperial College, we could have maybe had more than 1 billion deaths in China by now. Now, the reality, the reality is the numbers of whatever you're going to do in China, the numbers are always going to be big, just because your sample size is massive, right? So it is possible. I'm not going to dismiss it that maybe 500,000 or 1 million people will have ended up dying from COVID in China. But we also have to realize it's a sample size of 1.2 billion people. The reality is, if we look at the experience of pretty much any country out there, COVID was never the big killer that was sold to us in the first place. And the more the disease evolved, the less deadly it became. The alpha and delta variants were quite deadly, and then by the time you got to Omicron, it was massively contagious, but not very deadly. And in fact, by the time you got to Omicron, and to your point about the 95-year-old and 102-year-old scientists who perhaps were felled by COVID, you got to a point where the only people who died from COVID were 90-year-olds and plus. But we also know that once you're past 90, if you catch pretty much anything, if you catch the flu, there's a good chance you're gonna go on the wrong side.
Just thinking about China, what do we know? I mean, they basically started putting an end to the lockdown policies in November.
And so what we know is this, and we know this from foot traffic in shopping malls, and we know this from road traffic. We know that COVID probably peaked in China in terms of the number of infections. We peaked somewhere between late December and early January. That basically mid-December to mid-January, everybody got sick. And the reason it ran through China so quickly, much more quickly than pretty much any other country, is twofold. First, Omicron is more contagious, less deadly, but more contagious. And secondly, there's a population density in China that you have in very few countries. China is roughly the same landmass as the United States, but it's 4 times the population, and everybody lives on the East Coast because you can't live on the Tibetan Plateau, you can't live in the Gobi Desert. And so it just ran through the population. And yes, I do believe there was a month where mid-December to mid-January where everybody got sick. And now
you say everybody got sick, everybody contracted Omicron, or there was a large degree of that virus moving around. What do we actually know, though, about how sick people got and what the effect on hospitals were? Because again, Western media was absolutely wall to wall with pretty much anecdotal stories of hospitals being overwhelmed. There was occasional footage that would come of a corridor in a hospital looking very busy. And it's very hard to know because we had the same thing in the north of Italy right at the beginning of the pandemic, and it's now generally accepted that hospitals were sort of overflowing in northern Italy. I'm not sure exactly what the truth is or how many hospitals it affected. What do we know about China?
I think if you can find some cases, I think in Beijing, I think in Shanghai, I think in countries where, in cities, not in countries, in cities where you have extremely dense population, and where frankly, if you look at the past 20 years, when you arrive in China, you think, oh, this is a first world country. You have a beautiful airport, a fast speed train that takes you into the city. It's absolutely, the infrastructure is first class. China's been very good at building the hardware. Building the software that goes behind it, putting in the doctors, the nurses, putting in the university professors. This thing is built over generations. You can build a university building. It doesn't mean you get a world-class university. You can build a hospital. It doesn't mean you have yet all the trained doctors, the trained nurses, etc. This takes many generations of one doctor training the next one, who then trains the next one, etc. So China's grown very, very fast, and it's done a great job putting in the hardware, but the software hasn't followed, which was always the sort of argument for China staying locked down. They were worried, indeed, that the hospitals would become overwhelmed. And I do believe that, look, there were probably hospitals here and there that did become overwhelmed. Having said that, again, Omicron just isn't that deadly. If you and I catch Omicron, we're not going to rush to the hospital. We're going to, go to bed. We're going to have a 39-degree fever, and we're going to get over it, just like we used to get over the flu every winter. Where Omicron is deadly is really for older people, right? It's and this is what all the statistics show. And so these are the people that are likely to show up at the hospital. And here, this is where you get to something that's very particular in China, and why we'll never probably know what the real death toll from all of this is that China, for the past 20 years, all the young people left the countryside and moved to the cities. And so you have a country that's 60% urban and very young, and 40% rural and very old. So the people dying are living in the countryside. Or potentially dying. I don't think it's anything as bad as the Western media makes it sound, because the Western media loves a pandemic story. It's a way to sell copy. So they love scare stories, and nothing scares more than a pandemic. So this was sort of the last kick of the last COVID kick.
Also, though, looking at the economic data, if this scenario was as frightening in China as the Western media make out, with all of these hospitals overflowing and people dying at such large volumes, it feels unlikely that the economic rebound would have been so swift. I mean, you don't kind of go out to restaurants and bars and shops if you're, everyone is in hospital and your grandmother's dying. So what has the economic data showed?
Here I would say it's obviously bounced back, and it's bouncing back strongly, but to put my cards on the table, I expected it to be even stronger than this. And I think so far, sort of 2 or 3 months in the economic recovery, it's good. It's bouncing back. Stock market's bouncing back. All the ISM surveys, which is a sort of indicator of expansion of growth or contracting growth, have all been surprising on the upside. So all the data is good, but I expected it to be much stronger. And I tend to believe that the next 3 to 6 months are going to be absolutely epic, because the amount of pent-up demand, people haven't consumed for 3 years. For 3 years, they went to work and went home. They didn't go to the movies, didn't go to the restaurants, didn't go travel. And that hasn't fully kicked in yet. It hasn't fully kicked in, first because people were sick. So while you're sick, obviously you stay at home. So number one. Number two, I think there's still a lot of impediments to, for example, people traveling. Here's a simple one. During COVID, a lot of people's passports expired, and it was impossible to renew your passport. So now you have hour-long queues in China at the passports office to get a passport, because people are keen to go abroad. And then once they get a passport, you can't get a plane ticket because there's not enough flights yet.
So the infrastructure is not yet. It takes a while to ramp back up.
Exactly. And during COVID, a lot of restaurants closed. So the restaurants that stayed open are completely full. But if you look at overall restaurant spending, it hasn't surged the way you would expect it, because there's the restaurants that are open are full, and then there's nothing else.
I'm interested in what your assessment is on the damage to the Chinese economy then, because this is, as an experiment goes, pretty much shutting down the country on and off for 3 years is it's like suffocating an economy, I would imagine.
It is bouncing back. I was just a super bull on it, and I remain a super bull on it, and it's good, but I was hoping for better. Now, to your point, as I look at it, I think, why isn't it better? There's two options. Once, it's just a question of timing, and when you work on markets, the temptation is always to think, I'm not wrong, I'm just early. But you can do that for a little bit, but not for too long. The other possibility, as you point out, is that through the 3 years of COVID lockdowns, a lot of damage was done to the Chinese economy, and so it's going to take a while to repair some of this unfolding damage that was done. Um, I'm still, yeah, I'm more in the first camp.
So is this idea that China, a kind of rebounding China, is going to kind of rescue the world economy and drive it back to growth? Is that accurate, do you think? And also, and do you think more like geopolitically or in terms of overall power, China is going to be dented by this COVID experience and it's held it back? Or do you think the sort of rise of China remains after this experience?
No, look, I think it was a massive policy failure. The lockdowns for 3 years, and it is going to be dented. Now, to your first point, does the Chinese economic rebound, foretell a greater global economic rebound? I think absolutely. In my career, I saw China rebound strongly in 2003, and that led to a global economic recovery. I saw it do the same thing 2009. I mean, 2009, everybody was talking, looking at their shoes, saying we're facing a lost decade. It's going to be a new normal of low growth, and China growth reaccelerated and led the whole world out of what looked like a massive depression. And we had a little bit of that in 2016, and I think, to be honest, we're going to see it again. Here's perhaps a simple indicator of it, but if you look at the top 20 companies in the world by market cap, so your Microsoft, your Googles, your Amazons, etc., there's only one of them out of the top 20 companies by market cap in the world. There's only one of them that continues to make new highs every single day. It's LVMH. LVMH, of the huge companies in the world, is the only, all the other ones are down 10, 20, 30% from their highs. LVMH just keeps on ratcheting higher because it's a China play. Because, this belief that you're going to have all this money flowing from China into European luxury goods, into tourism, into commodities, into automobiles, into, so many different things that, again, China hasn't done for 3 years. And I firmly believe it will happen. And I believe it will happen all the more so since the Chinese government realizes it's made a mistake. Like, it's in the awkward position of having managed to piss off both sides of the population, regardless of what they feel about COVID. If, like me, you think COVID was just a bad flu and we should have just never done all this stupidity, then in China, you're really pissed off that you've been on lockdown for 3 years. You've had 3 years of your life, stolen away from you. But if on the other side, you believed all the government propaganda and you were of the view that COVID is the new Black Plague, then you're pissed off that you reopened so quickly and that, you didn't plan with Paxlovid and you didn't buy the Pfizer vaccines or whatever else, whatever government propaganda you tend to believe in, you're pissed off that the Chinese government didn't go down that particular path. So they're now in a situation where they need to change the topic of conversation. If you're the Chinese government, you want the chatter on Weibo or on WeChat to be about anything but COVID. And the easiest way to do that is to get an economic boom going, to basically make the reopening worth it. And that's why, in recent weeks, you've seen them basically take away all the restriction on real estate lending. They had pretty strict restrictions on real estate lending, a policy called the 3 red lines. They said, we're removing that. So banks, you can go out and lend to whoever you want. They've recapitalized the local authorities to get the local authorities to do infrastructure spending again. They're basically pressing on every button and pushing every lever to adding fuel to get a boom going.
There's one other way that they could try and change the conversation, and probably what I'm going to say, which is Taiwan. Because there's a lot of talk about that at the moment, obviously, with Russia. I know that we spoke before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and you were a little bit more skeptical that was going to happen at the pace it did. What say you now about the risks of China going against Taiwan in some way, whether it's an actual attack or just a blockade or whatever?
All right, so let me make like a Jesuit priest and answer your question with another question. Why did China change its COVID policy? Because you had 50,000 people on the street, right? They saw 50,000 people on the street and they folded like a deck of cards. Um, they couldn't shift it fast enough. Which incidentally, when Westerners think about protests in China, we immediately envisage Tiananmen Square in 1989, the students getting shut down, because these were very powerful images. The guy in front of the tank, etc. These were extremely powerful images. Um, the reality is, you get tens of thousands of protests in China every year. They're not covered by the Western media because they're about local issues. It's about polluted water or local authorities who stole land or whatever else. And the modus operandi of the Chinese government is to give in. They blame middle management. They blame the local mayor. They blame the local party secretary. They fire them or just move them somewhere else. And they give in to the demonstrators, whatever the demonstrators want. I highlight this because if you've just had your big policy shift because you had 50,000 people on the street, do you now start a war? Well, if you're going to have 50,000 people on the street for COVID, you're going to have 500,000 if you start a war. Because in China, remember, you now had 2 generations of one-child policy. When I'm French, and I come from a military family, and when we used to go at it against Germany, people in France had 5, 6, 7 kids. You send 4 boys off to war, 3 come back or 2 come back, and it's very sad for the guys who don't, but life goes on. When you have one child, you don't send him to war. No way, no way. And so that's for the particularities of Chinese society that make a military action, in my mind, very unlikely. But then you've got the military aspect of it, like invading Taiwan. I mean, we've seen how hard invading Ukraine is, and that's just sending tanks over wheat fields. Invading Taiwan, you got to cross over 100 miles of sea to land on one of 3 beaches, because Taiwan only has 3 beaches, and invade a country that's a chain of mountains falling into the sea. Mountains in Taiwan go up to 12,000 feet. It's like, this is like, Taiwan is a natural fortress. And are you going to try to do this with an army and a navy and an air force that is completely untested? No, there's no way.
What you're saying is that you think the sort of geology, the topography of Taiwan, combined with the sociological factors in China, plus the economic ones, you just don't buy it as a risk. I mean, we had John Gray on this program. We've had a bunch of people who have been really quite worried that some kind of China action against Taiwan could be imminent in the next year or two. You disagree?
I vehemently disagree. I would go one step further. The U.S. Navy during World War II thought, we're going to invade Taiwan and use that as a launch pad to then take over Japan, because Taiwan had been a Japanese territory since 1895. And the U.S. Navy studied it and said, it's impossible to do. We're going to bypass Taiwan and we're going to go straight to Okinawa. Because invading Okinawa was a lot less hard than invading Taiwan. So now, granted, you could say that was in 1945. We have different weapons now, et cetera. Now, to be clear, if China wanted to destroy Taiwan, it could. It could just send nuclear bombs on it, or just bomb the hell out of it. But taking it, it's not gonna happen. But I want to go back to your first question on, what does this COVID policy mistake mean for geostrategically for China? Does that mean that, now that China's reopening, is it arising, et cetera? If you're China, you have, I think, 3 key weaknesses that the Western world can squeeze you on. The first weakness is your dependency on imported energy. And I think that's being dealt with really rapidly thanks to the Ukraine war. Basically,
because they now have access to Russian energy.
Exactly. They can take over all of the Russian energy that used to go to Europe. Now, you could tell me, well, the infrastructure is not there, et cetera. It's going to take time to build, and that's true. But then who's really good at building infrastructure quickly and cheaply? China. So that part of the equation, I think, is going to get solved. The second big weakness of China is its dependency on the US dollar to fund a lot of its trade. And so if the US decided to do what it's done to Russia or Venezuela or Iran and say, you're not allowed to use the US dollar anymore, nobody can trade with China in US dollars, China would have a real quandary. Now, so would the US, because that would just lead to a complete implosion in global trade and could seriously undermine the US dollars. For the US, it could be like cutting your nose to spite your face. But that's a threat. And then the third threat, which I think China didn't see coming, is its dependence on foreign semiconductors, right? And that's where the U.S. decided to bring the battle. The U.S. decided, you know what, this is our comparative advantage. We're dominating the tech space, so we're going to squeeze China on semiconductors, and we're going to cut them out of there. Now, this is where Taiwan came into question.
Right, because 90% of the world's semiconductors are made in Taiwan.
And South Korea, Taiwan and South Korea. But yeah, no. And the very high end is all made in Taiwan. So the view was, oh, if now that the U.S. is cutting off China from semiconductors, it's going to be very tempting for China to invade Taiwan to get to the semiconductors. To be honest, that's stupid, because if China invades Taiwan, it does. Semiconductor plants are not oil wells. If Iraq invades Kuwait, they get the oil wells. If China invades Taiwan, they have a hole in the ground where a factory used to be called TSMC used to be. It's like the factory's gone, and the semiconductor engineers are gone. So, you don't invade Taiwan to get semiconductors. It just doesn't add up. What you can do if you're China is you go to Taiwan and you go to TSMC and UMC and you go to the engineers and you say, you make 100, I'll pay you 300 to move to the mainland and work for me, and work for Alibaba, work for Tencent, work for SMIC, and develop new semiconductor solutions for China. And it's not a hard pitch, because culturally, it's like moving from Canada to the US. It's same language, same food. This is where China shot itself in the foot with the COVID lockdowns. I think China was doing this in spades before they decided to do the COVID lockdowns. During the COVID lockdown, now imagine you're a semiconductor engineer, like a high-end semiconductor engineer at TSMC. You make very good money. China comes over and says, I'll pay you 3 times as much. You think, oh, I'm going to move there. And then China shuts down, and now you're on lockdown for 3 years. You're like, oh, screw this, I'm moving back to Taiwan. Excuse my French. It's like, this doesn't work for me. So the COVID lockdown, I think, sets China back on one of its key policies, which is gaining semiconductor independence, because it can't get semiconductor independence on its own. It's got to go out and hire the talent, at least initially, to sort of give it the
But I guess going forward, if they're opening up again, they can begin that project anew.
Yes, and they will. It's just going to cost them more. Instead of paying 3 times, they're going to have to pay 5 times. But that's still cheaper than invading.
But so I'm going to conclude in what I think is a bit of a more optimistic note then, Louis, because what you seem to be saying is, first of all, the disaster that was promised or warned about in China as they opened up has not been as bad as some people feared. The economy is gradually getting back to normal, even though not maybe as fast as you might have thought. But perhaps more importantly, by your judgment, the chances of an invasion of Taiwan are very slim, because you've pointed out there are various difficulties, and on the key question of semiconductors, the better strategy is to buy them, buy the companies, buy the staff, buy the experts, rather than invade.
Much cheaper to, even if you're paying completely the wrong price for your engineers, you have to go out and hire 100 engineers. Even if you pay 5 times, 10 times the price, it's still going to be so much cheaper than invasion. Look at how much the invasion is costing Russia. And for what result in the end? No.
So China then stays friendly. It doesn't invade Taiwan. The economy bounces back, and it drags the world out of this semi-recession, and we're back to boom times.
Exactly, but here's on to this point. Not everybody benefits the same from China's reopening, right? If you're an emerging market, you're probably going to benefit more. If you're Japan, Korea, you're right on your doorstep. I think if you're Europe, you actually participate in it. The guys who benefit the least is the US, because the whole, trade friction, etc., that knife cuts both ways. For the past 5 years, every Chinese corporate has spent the past 5 years trying to de-Americanize their supply chain, because nobody wants to be Huawei. 5 years ago, the US government says no more semiconductors to Huawei, and Huawei basically is now a shadow of its former itself. It just completely imploded. If you're today a Chinese company, you live in fear that you could be Huawei next. So you want to make sure that everything in your supply chain doesn't use American components. Take automobiles as an example. in your typical car, you have about $3,000 worth of chemical products. A lot of these chemical products have been produced by the US big chemical companies, the DuPont, the Dow Chemicals, etc., because they have a huge comparative advantage given that they have such a cheap cost of energy in the US. So you can produce chemical products at a much cheaper price. So, you know, Chinese autos would buy US chemical products. But now if you're a Chinese auto producer, you worry, well, what if tomorrow the US decides no more chemical products to China? Maybe you're better off paying for BASF or Clariant or Sumitomo Chemical or, you know, somebody else. You pay a higher price, but you get greater security.
And where are those companies then? Are they in Europe or elsewhere in Asia?
Europe, South Korea, Japan. I think today, if you're China, your first choice, of course, is if I can find a Chinese producer, that's the best, because then nobody's going to pull the rug from under my feet. If I can't find a US Chinese producer, then probably South Korea is going to be second best, because, you know, the South Korea is never going to want to walk away from China. It's too big a market, and so on.
Okay, so you've added a bit of a note of caution to my optimistic
No.
conclusion.
I'm super optimistic.
But in terms of the world picture, because yes, you think China bounced back. Yes, it sort of drags the world economy forward, but the shape of the power and the shape of the economic power that emerges after this slump is slightly different, and once again, it's skewed against America, because Chinese companies have made themselves more resilient and are trying to opt out of American supply chains. So maybe it's better for the rest of the world.
I think so. Look, the U.S. corporate's loss will be Japan's gain, or it'll be Korea's gain, or it'll be Europe's gain. And I think that's what the markets are reflecting. You know, last year, European equities outperformed U.S. equities in spite of Ukraine, in spite of the fears of, energy crisis in Europe. And the whole outperformance in Europe happened in the last 2 months of the year. It happened as China was reopening. Europe benefits from China reopening much more so than the US. So to your point, yes, you know, China reopening is good news for the rest of the world. It is a super important economy. So you know, China stopping being stupid is great news. But it's not great news equally for everybody. Some will benefit more than others.
Louis Gave, as always, a pleasure to hear your ideas.
My pleasure. Great to see you. Thank you very much.
That was Louis-Vincent Gave, the co-founder of GavCal, a company that observes what's going on in the economy and tries to look beyond the media spin at the fundamentals to find out what's really happening. They have a particular focus on China, and he joined us there from Hong Kong. Don't say we never bring you good news. He was very bullish, not only about the reopening in China, the return to normal for the world economy, a little bit of a note of caution there that the US may not be as much of a beneficiary as some other parts of the world. But overall, I think we have done our good news service for the month. Let's hope he's right. Thanks for joining. This was UnHerd.